A little bit. Okay. Oops, that's low. Okay, all right, let's go. I think everything's working here, I hope. Okay. Okay, yes, after class today, I will go and upload, I think I had added 2 slides with quotations to the work one, and I have a fixed up one on families that has less slides than maybe the one you have. So I'll go upload those both after I'm done here. Okay, we'll do that. Yeah, what am I doing? I want to clear this. Okay, so let me just double check one thing here. Sort of plan, we don't have a ton of content left to cover today. Oops. What we will cover are remaining slides in this sex and intimacy unit. And then, on Friday, we'll do some review. So wherever we end today, we end, it might be early, it should be on time at very least, and we will kind of go from there. Okay, so last time, actually, let me check my question slide again. Last time we were talking, we finished talking about hookup culture. We started talking a little bit about pornography, and obviously pornography, a big and kind of interesting issue, especially when it has to do with young people, because consumption is widespread, And increasingly, right, we have sort of two major areas of concern when it comes to the research. Now, I will say, like, if you look at the body of what you might call porn studies, it's kind of broadly split into two camps, right? And one, I think, would be, anti-porn and pro-porn. Increasingly, though, I do think you have sort of like a porn critical school that's kind of appeared, which is, rather than being anti-porn, it's just kind of looking at what we know about what pornography does to people, to their expectations, to things like body image, and a whole lot of other things like that. I mean, the anti-porn stuff, I think, is mostly like second wave feminist. And you have like Andrea Dworkin, Gail Dines in this kind of camp. And then, I'd say pro-porn is usually like third wave feminism, or what's sometimes called sex positive feminism. And I mean, both sides, I think, have some interesting arguments. The anti-porn and second wave feminism kind of school mostly looks at, how porn is exploitative, especially of women, right? And that kind of third wave feminist tends to be like sex positive or pro-porn, in the sense that it's like, engaging in porn or even things like sex work is, a matter of sexual expression. And they'll often note things like, the fact that, it may have kind of beneficial social effects, in that it's long been sort of understood that as people get more access to pornography, rates of rape and sexual assault tend to fall. Now, it's definitely in that camp. But increasingly, and kind of more what I'm interested in, is sort of maybe like what you call a porn critical school, in that it looks at, pornography, its kind of social effects, in I think a pretty dispassionate and non-moralistic way, to try and get at what potentially pornography might do when it's widely introduced into a society. And from this, right, what we tend to see is kind of two major areas of concern. One is around body image. And this is for both males and females, right? For both men and women. And I'll show you some kind of stuff out of some meta-analyses that looked at some of the kind of broad porn research to suggest why this might be a problem. And then questions about relationship, and especially about behavior, right? Sexual behavior in particular. Okay, so body image, right? This is pretty straightforward. And again, these two articles, if you care to take a look, they're worth your time, especially this one coming out of the Atlantic. It's a bit old now, right? Looking at 7 years old, about the possibility of a sex recession. But so here, from this Naomi Wolf piece, right, her kind of work on, and that's out of New York Magazine. Let me grab my highlighter. I had to mediate a heated debate between two students on the various merits of My Little Pony today. And that has taken all of my mental energy. And you think I'm joking, but I'm actually not. There was all sorts of My Little Pony related chicanery going on in my other class, and it was super amusing. But it's left me a little brain dead. That, and spending almost 3 hours of my day looking at financial statement spreadsheets for some paperwork I have to get in by Halloween. And my brain is a little dead. So forgive me if I stop making sense. Okay, so this is what is in that Naomi Wolf piece. So what does she hear on college campuses? Women say they can't compete, and they know it. And I always like how she puts it here. How can a real woman with pores, her own sexual needs and all of that, possibly compete with a cyber vision of perfection, especially one that spouts phrases like, more, you big stud. And especially that these, pornography is downloadable and extinguishable at will, right? So it's really easy, and, again, I'll talk about this on the last slide of this unit, really, really cheap, right? It's really cheap. It's really easy for men in particular to get sexual satisfaction without all that messiness that comes with relationships, right? Actually having to talk to another human being. Hard, but fun. Okay, mostly the hard is, it's a lot easier to just use pornography. All right, and this, out of this piece in the Atlantic, right, looking at some of the research, this major Dutch study, and I'll show you some quotes from it in a little bit, found that among men, frequency of porn viewing was associated with concerns about, genital size, oh dear. And you heard much the same kind of concerns from a lot of men, that compared to what they were seeing in pornography, their bodies didn't measure up. Okay, so this is taken from a sort of meta-analysis where Owens et al. Went, oops, I still have a highlighter here, not a pen, went and looked, and they did a review of the research, right? So this, again, is 2012, so it's a little bit dated. I've been looking around, and I haven't seen another kind of meta-analysis of the research that's quite like this, but I think the findings are recognizable enough. So what do we got? So participants discussed, watched, what did they see, right? Inferred, or messages inferred as they related to female body image, and what was it? Well, girls should be a particular way, right? The girls should be small, thin, and inferior, while the guys should be muscular and superior, right? That from Hagstrom, Norden et al. In 2006, right? So they did qualitative interviews with people who were watching pornography. And what else did it show? That increasingly people describe what they call a pornographic script for body type and sexual performance reinforced by consumption of pornography, right? And basically, this left both males and females feeling extremely self-conscious about a whole bunch of aspects around their body, around sexual performance, and all of that. So it created created unrealistic and concerning expectation for both males and females who participated in the study. What did the men feel? Why don't we put the men in a different color here in blue? Insecurities about their ability to perform. And what did women think? Well, women were worried about insecurities about their body image, right? And there's fun quotes in this. Males in the study discussed concern about being able to perform as well sexually and for the same duration as men in porn. And this is, not to put too fine a point on it, an interesting kind of problem in the sense that, porn isn't real life. If you didn't know that, I've just told you. And often, people who are acting in pornography are, taking, shall we say, performance-enhancing drugs. They're often taking Viagra and other things to allow them to stay that way. There's, cuts, there's different scenes, they're filmed at different times. So porn doesn't always reflect reality, but viewers didn't interpolate that, right? So men were worried about being able to perform, and women, felt that the women they saw represented an ideal body type. And one said she felt very unattractive, even though you say you're not influenced, right? Everybody sort of is, right? You want to have those ideal bodies. Okay, so that's on the body image side. On the behavior and relationship side, potentially even more concerning. And this comes from Hebernick et al., or Herbernick et al. I always say Hebernick, but it's Herbernick et al., right? And this is a little bit more recent study from about 6 years ago. And let me see where I can find these. I can't really highlight because I have bad colors on the screen. More women than men reported someone had done something during sex that made them feel scared, right? Which we would sort of expect, right? Men are more likely to be violent and they're stronger. So they're more likely to do things that kind of scare their partners. 12.5% of adolescent women, 3.8% of adolescent men indicated that this had happened to them, as did almost a quarter of adult women, right? So a quarter of adult women said that something had happened during sex that made them feel scared, and about 10% of adult men. And what are the kind of things that make them feel scared? Okay, so choking and other aggressive behaviors. such as hitting and forceful hair pulling, were often described in those experiences, right? Now, choking here is a misnomer, right? This is sort of using porn industry lingo to describe what is going on, but really how it should be described. And if you ask like a medical doctor, what's happening when people talk about choking, you're actually talking about strangulation, right? One partner is strangling the other, often for erotic purposes, but it is strangulation. Choking is when you bite a piece of a bagel and it gets stuck in your throat. Strangulation is when someone puts their hands on your throat and, kind of potentially cuts off your, your oxygen supply. Now, this kind of behavior, strangulation, choking, was virtually unknown, right? It was a very niche sexual interest until about 15 years ago, when it started to appear a lot in mainstream pornography, at which point the incidences of it increased quite a bit. Okay, now why is this potentially a problem, right? So it's among those scary experiences, and like anal sex, it appears to have become common, because of sexually explicit material. And where's my other thing? Most instances of choking or strangulation were not discussed with partners in advance, right? And I'm gonna see if I can highlight this. I don't know if my highlighter will work, but I want to. The other person just started choking the respondent. So that makes sense. Consequently, some worried they were being strangled, common form of intimate partner violence, especially committed against women who partner with men, right? Okay, what's my next slide? I want to say something here, because I ran across this and I meant to add a slide on it. It's become a sort of serious concern, right? And on the kind of fringes of kind of the healthcare industry, you're starting to hear kind of murmurings about this. And if you pay attention, you'll kind of pick up on why this is a problem. And again, I should have put a slide in because I found a study. So the second leading cause of strokes in women under 40 and this is in the UK, right? And this was reported in The Guardian, is choking, right? So now the first leading cause of strokes so mostly women under 40 shouldn't be having strokes, right? Strokes typically something that happens to older people. The number one cause of strokes in women under 40 is pregnancy, because there's a condition that happens in pregnancy called preeclampsia, which is basically there's just too much fluid in your body, right? Because your blood volume increases when you're pregnant, and that causes really, really high blood pressure, and that can lead to strokes. So pregnancy and post-birth preeclampsia is the number one cause. Now, you would sort of expect that it's a relatively normal medical condition in women. But for the second leading cause of strokes in women under 40 to be, choking essentially during sex, is something very new. It's something that's popped up really in the last 5 years, and it suggests an increasing prevalence in this behavior. And it's something we don't know a lot about yet, right? I think we'll see these numbers sort of coming up more and more as more information comes out of places like the US, Canada, and Australia. But it does seem to be largely driven by porn. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? So, kind of lots of different points. And again, most of this from this Atlantic article, which did a really good job of sort of summarizing the research. So, what does it say? This Atlantic author say, studies show that in the absence of high quality sex ed, teen boys look to porn to understand sex. Okay, I call BS on this. And it's not that I don't think boys are turning to porn to understand sex. I just think you could have the best sex ed in the world, and your teacher talking to you about sex is still going to be less appealing to most people than going on Pornhub. I don't know why, but like a clinical talk about sex in the classroom, just doesn't seem to have the influence that hours and hours of media consumption are going to have, right? Like what did we, if we go back to the kind of beginning, questions. There's my pony. Anyway, I'm sorry. I did that just to mess with Yasmin. Because I'm being either mean or nice to her, right? 90% of children 8 to 16 have viewed porn, right? You're going to get, that's prior to most sex ed programs starting, and it's quite a bit. I don't know if I have a stat on the time, right? It's a fair bit of time. I don't have one, but I used to have one in a different slide. 60 extra letters on the relationship slide. I have no idea what you're talking about. 60 extra letters? Okay, I'm not sure what you're saying, but maybe you can clear that up for me. Okay, relationships. Here, okay, I'm not sure what that comment means. What does chaste mean again? Oh, okay. Hang on, we'll get back to that in a sec. I'm going to finish what I was talking about, and then we'll answer that question. Was I here? Okay, so I kind of call BS on this only in the sense that when we talk about, there's so much porn consumption that inevitably there's going to be a certain learned behavior from pornography. Okay, modeling behavior after what you see on screen can lead to what's called spectatoring, right? Worrying about how you look, sound, while you're having sex. A behavior sex researcher, Masters and Johnson, long ago said was bad for sexual functioning, right? And especially women have long kind of struggled with this. They felt pressure to emulate porn actresses. Okay, and this one from a book called Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, says violent porn increasingly is terrifying to young girls, or it terrifies young girls about the men and the prospect of sex with them, right? And so, potentially, what we can posit, and certainly Schreier and some others have, bless you, posited this about violent pornography, is that it may be contributing to that decline in kind of that sex recession, right? That, especially for young women, the risk of potentially having these things happen or encountering men whose sexual behavior is largely modeled on pornography is potentially seen as too risky to bother with. So they just don't partner. Okay, now I'm going to go answer these questions. Relationship partnering slide. Do you have an old version that has a bunch of garbage on it? Okay, I'll fix that too. I must have cleaned my version up and then that version somehow ended up with a bunch of garbage on it. I don't know why. Okay, I will. What does chaste mean again? Chaste means someone is running after you. No, I'm kidding. That's the wrong chaste. Okay. I don't know why. I must have leaned on my keyboard. Okay, the final exam? I'm not talking about the final. Yes, it is, by the way. Okay. You can write it anytime on the day that it is. I don't know why. Okay, chaste. So what does chaste mean? Chaste basically means kind of generally non-sexual, right? Or retaining sexual activity to a very limited sphere. But like a chaste idea of romance is basically one that doesn't include sex, at least not very much. Okay, so just to confirm, you all want to know about the midterm. That's for next class. Can't you wait? No, I know. Stress. Yes, you can write it anytime. 60 letters. It's on the PDF, not the PowerPoint. Oh, I didn't fix the PDF. Too many files. Yeah, I mean, I would say this, like in the US, things like Catholic education are very, very limited. Catholic schools, I don't think even in Alberta are entirely absence-based. I think they teach the provincial curriculum. Now, I don't know that the provincial curriculum is all that good, but I think that's maybe a bit of a universal statement for Catholic schools. Why would porn show strangulation if it's not popular at the time? This ends up being sort of a chicken and the egg problem. And a lot of people will argue about the porn industry that one of the things that porn tends to need is increasingly more extreme kind of things in order to keep people coming back, right? Essentially, people get bored. So people who've tracked, like you can look at the work of Gail Dines on this. Now, Gail is in the hard anti-porn feminist kind of category, but she is one of those weird creatures that has what I would describe as the worst job I've ever heard of. Like, she spends most of her time, by her own description, or she might be retired now, but when she was working, she would go to Pornhub and she would just like watch whatever videos were on the front page of Pornhub and just describe what was in them. And I'm like, that sounds like a bad job. Like, I don't think I would want that at all. So anyway, but she's kind of tracked the change over time, right? How porn, which has, and she used to do this in porn shops in the UK, right? She would actually just like go into the adult video store and like survey all of the titles and what was going on. And she sort of tracked an over time, yes, it's non-cumulative, over time, just a kind of increasing, how to put this, extremism in the kind of content that's being presented in especially mainstream pornography, right? So it gets worse and worse. And the idea here is, and maybe this is a straight up effects model in media. Come take a different class with me. We'll talk about effects models. So 444, critical media studies. But the idea is this is sort of like porn is going to shape people's behavior because they consume a lot of it. And as they consume more of it, and you see things like choking, anal sex, and all of these things, that behavior, which was once fringe, becomes much more normalized, right? And I think there's pretty strong evidence in that direction. Okay, how is random strangulation not straightforward assault? Well, it should be, right? In a perfect world, right, if someone starts choking you during sex, you should straight up report them to the police. But I think like a lot of activities, right, whether it's, any kind of intimate partner violence, date rape, acquaintance rape, often it goes unreported, right? It happened, you feel shitty and scared about it, you leave, but you're like kind of ambivalent about, not ambivalent, like it sucked, but you're sort of not sure in what category it falls because you were being intimate with that person. Did they interpret something you did as consent towards that thing, right? It's kind of normalized in a lot of pornography. You didn't like it. Maybe they stopped when you said to stop, right? Lots of different things can happen here. But again, people are not sure, right? They're not sure what their rights are. They're not sure really what happens, and it could take a while. You see this again with like acquaintance rape all the time. It takes a while sometimes for people to figure out what happened and that they actually, were assaulted. And then by then they're like, oh man, that happened 3 months ago. Should I still report it? They're not sure. They don't report it. And that's how this sort of stuff plays out. And you see that all over in all sorts of like sexual violence, right? People are not sure what happened. They're not sure if they did something that would have invited that behavior or whatnot, right? Okay. Yeah, that's totally right. People figure out what happened. They realize that, they were assaulted. But again, sometimes they don't want to report it. Sometimes they don't want to relive the trauma. Sometimes they feel like no one's going to listen because it happened 3 months ago and why are you just reporting it now? And of course, that makes sense too, because we know the legal system often doesn't take those claims particularly seriously. Okay, so, all right. Oh no, I'm not done. All right, I have to turn my slide back on. It's going to torment Yasmin with ponies just scattered through the course for no reason. I know she can take it. She's strong. Okay, last slide of this unit. So this is one of those slides with a lot, it doesn't look like a lot of text, but there's a lot here. And we've kind of talked about this already when we talked about families, when we talked about marriage, right? Because a lot of these come from Rigneris again, so the same kind of ideas. But this time, from his book, his 2017 book, Cheap Sex. Really interesting book. And again, if you're into kind of sociology literature about relationships and sex, well worth your time to read in detail. So what that particular book, the argument that it makes, is that basically the world of sex and relationships has been fundamentally transformed from one in which sex was expensive, right? In that if you wanted, as a man, especially to have sex with a woman, it cost you a lot, right? There was some kind of commitment that went with it, because for women there was a lot of risk. Now, what Regnerus, and what he says, right, one of the major factors inhibiting the formation of relationships and marriages among young people is what he calls cheap sex. So he says that cheap sex is the triangulation of the social effects brought on by 3 technologies, right? So think triangulation, right? It's a term taken from kind of radar. If you have 3 points that you're receiving a signal at, based on, how long it takes the signal to get to each place, you can use that to figure out where the signal is coming from, right? So if we're triangulating effects, we can sort of say these 3 things are causing a series of social effects. And all sorts of things like delayed relationship formation, fewer marriages, and I think increasingly a sex recession and an ambivalence around sex amongst young people. Okay, so this is all the result of this big project he did called the Relationship in America Project, where they did surveys of 15,738 Americans aged 18 to 60. Okay, so there are these 3 technologies, right? Let's go through them in turn. Contraception, right? We'll just put the pill, but obviously there's more forms of contraception. So contraception, you can really easily understand how it lowered the sort of cost of sex, because it separated, conception, right, or babies from sex, right? Those 2 get split apart, and that makes it much easier, especially for women, to have sex with much less kind of demand for commitment from men, right? It really is, it's hard to hard to overstate how big of a transformation in human life the birth control pill and other forms of contraception are, because they fundamentally transform our whole understanding of what relationships are and what they're there to do. And really, relationships go from being about, allowing people to have sex while also creating a system that broadly supports the women who have babies and the babies who are then, sort of the result of sex. Once contraception comes in, all of that gets kind of scrambled up. It's not completely over, but broadly speaking, right, you can have sex more or less without necessarily getting pregnant and having a baby. Now, so that one's really easy to understand. Online dating is a little different. And I'll talk about, so Tinder and other online dating sites. What they do is a couple of things. And here, let me actually erase all my doodles so I have space to write. So, they do 2 things. So, increases the number. So, increase in the number of potential partners. Right? So, if you took a kind of average industrial society prior to online dating, the number of, so basically how you would find a romantic or sexual partner was typically you would meet them in a place where you both are. So, school, church, university, right? Some kind of social club, community league, dance hall, bar, whatever, right? Some kind of shared space. On the whole, the number of potential partners for the average person is 1 to 200, right? Maybe, acquaintances, cousins, friends would introduce you to people that they know. And so your total pool of potential, romantic and sexual partners is somewhere between 100 and 200 people. Okay, and someone open your Tinder and tell me how many people are, no, I'm kidding. When you get into online dating, right, the available pool multiplies by orders of magnitude, right? Suddenly, you're not restricted to your immediate social circumstances. You know, where you are, friends, friends of friends, relatives, all of that goes out the window. You can meet just anybody. Now, this has had some really interesting social effects. It's really scrambled, our understanding of who meets and who gets together and why. It used to be organized really broadly around very segregated sort of social class and racial lines, and that's kind of gone out the window, right? So we have much more, interracial relationships now than we ever did, and that seems to be largely a function of online dating, just allowing people of different races to meet in a much more efficient way, whereas before those spaces were much more segregated. So kind of a good thing. So it's fundamentally changed that, but the increased number also makes it much easier. You know, there's a reason things like Tinder are called hookup apps. If you just want a quick sexual encounter, it definitely makes it easier to find that with someone else who's interested in the same thing, right? Something that used to be relatively difficult. So the increased number, definitely there, and that lowers the cost of sex. The other one, and this is not something that Regnerus observed, interesting, but actually, was observed by Louise Perry in a book called, I'll just put the kind of letters, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And it's a really, really interesting book. I think Perry is an interesting thinker who said some kind of broadly interesting things. Case Against the Sexual Revolution, but the case she makes about online dating is it broadly removes social pressure to treat people well. And here, how am I doing for time? Oh, lots of time. So it removes that social pressure to treat people well. And here, right, to put this in very kind of general terms, in the past, right, let's say you were wanting to date someone and your cousin set you up with a friend, right? Someone they knew, someone from their school, right? They were like, oh, you're gonna love this person, they're great. And you went out with that person and, you acted like a complete jerk. You, instead of, being, say, gentlemanly or whatever, you tried to get into her pants right away in ways that she didn't appreciate. What would end up happening is she would go back to your cousin, and then that cousin's giving you hell, right? They're yelling at you. They're like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Pardon my language. Why would you act like that to this nice person? Like, I introduced you, but I was expecting you to act like a human, right? And then, probably not only am I gonna not set you up with anyone ever again, I'm gonna tell all our aunts, uncles, cousins, what a huge jerk you are and screw up your reputation, right? So real social consequences happen, which moderates behavior, right? People won't go and act like creeps, mostly when there's social pressure not to. Online dating completely removes that, right? Because all of a sudden you have no relation to the people who are approaching you on online dating apps, have no prior relationship, and you really have no recourse if something goes wrong, right? You can block them or whatever, but you can't harm them socially, so there's no social consequences. And again, this makes all sorts of creepy and weird behaviors much more normalized. Okay, and then, how are we doing here? Well, I don't know what happened. No. Okay. That's okay, you didn't miss much. Okay. You can't see, oh no, you think you've gone blind. That's all the porn. No, I'm kidding. That's an old wives' tale. So, porn, right? Let's talk porn. What Regnerus says is porn is the cheapest sex of all, right? And going back to that kind of Naomi Wolf quote, porn sort of takes sex and removes it from the context of human beings. Basically, if you need to, find sexual satisfaction, it's very easy to open the browser on on your computer or your phone or your tablet or an increasing panoply of devices that have browsers built in, go find something, watch a video, do what you do when you watch that video, and then when you're done, you just kind of close it, and there's no, how shall we say, cuddling. There's no having to buy, question whether you have to buy the person breakfast in the morning. None of that, right? It is basically a sexual experience, that can be very tailored to exactly what you find interesting and want, and comes essentially with no demands, right? Because, though that was a human being that was filmed or photographed, you have no relationship to that human being and no real requirement to do anything for them. Right now, occasionally, as we get into the internet era, you will have things like cam sites, right, where you're paying essentially the person to perform sex acts for you, or things like OnlyFans, right, where you might have a sort of like social media-esque relationship with that person, or more likely some handler that they've paid to chat with you on OnlyFans, and pretend that they are that same woman, right? And I, look at any kind of media accounts on what happens behind the scenes for OnlyFans. It's quite exploitative, and often, right, the really big OnlyFans stars have teams of people that are answering chat messages for them, allowing them to, potentially interact with thousands or tens of thousands of typically men, but in a way that seems like it's a one-to-one relationship, right? But all of this really, is super cheap in terms of social costs, right? Might cost your wallet quite a bit of money, but in terms of social costs and what you actually owe to the person, it's relatively little. And again, it's sort of, and the case that Rigneris makes is it disincentivizes men in particular to make themselves marriageable, right? So when we start to see, right, incels, right, or other men who it seems like don't have their lives together, right? They don't have good jobs. They're not working on education, right? What Rigneris says that in the past, in order to get sex, because it was so expensive, you had to prove you were worth it. Increasingly, in the era of online dating and porn, it becomes less the case, right? Sex gets cheaper and cheaper. Porn is really cheap. And so men have far less incentive to work on themselves and get themselves to the point where someone would want to pay attention to them, right? And that in it, hit the gym, get a good job, have some prospects, all of that stuff used to be, part of that process, and increasingly it isn't, which means, again, you see a decline in marriageability. And if we want to go all the way back to the beginning of this unit, right, if I can find all the way to the past, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing the effects of this, I think, right? We're seeing the effects in, you've got a lot of non-marriageable men who now are simply kind of stuck, right? And they have no prospects of relationships. And part of that is being sort of held down by these three aspects of cheap sex. Okay, back to the end. That's all I got to say. I'm done 9 minutes early, which will never, ever happen again. Any questions? Other than that, we'll come back on Friday. I'll do a little bit of review. You can do some Q&A if you've got questions. I'll start off with Q&A, and then I'll look at some practice questions, and we can go from there. All right. See you on Friday.
So if we're sort of compared to the men, so I'm assuming that when we spoke with him yesterday, I don't remember what you did. You would say it's better with and that was better with them.
That's hypergamy.
Yes. Are there no terms of women who are also serious with the unmarriageable?
So
Just at least maybe.
The thing that will tend to make women unmarriageable is different, right? So, how to put it? So, because men's standards are considerably different, it's more around like beauty standards and things related to the body that can make a woman unmarriageable, right? In terms of like social prospects, men are much less concerned about this, right? Like men are much less concerned as does she have a good job? Is she upwardly mobile? It's more typically, is she really pretty, right? Men are simple creatures. They're dumb. They make bad choices. I have several friends who are now living the consequences of those bad choices. And they'll sort of admit, in retrospect, well, yeah, she was really hot. Um, what's that? Yeah, biology is a cruel mistress. So I think there are, unmarriageable women. And increasingly, I think what we're seeing is an argument that some people are making that excessive body counts, I don't love this argument, tend to make women unmarriageable as well, right? So women who've been very sexually active. I've seen this in like internet discourses and I don't like it. Right. But like, there's this one podcast called the Whatever Podcast. Yeah, and they just like bring on like OnlyFans girls who've had like 70 partners, and they're like, what man is ever gonna want you? There may be something to that, but I think, mostly if a woman is not physically attractive, that hurts her chances more than almost anything else.
Okay, I heard one other question, but it's like.
Yes, no, go ahead. Yeah, she asked one question. Now she's gonna go to the back.
Oh.
It's all good. Okay, that's fine. She just comes almost every class, so she feels like bad socially that she's monopolizing that time. That's why.
So yeah, just been reviewing some just random questions about everything in the midterm.
Okay.
My first question, with Mark Holt's argument, I was kind of confused with how he said that no challenges with international students. I just didn't really get how. Yeah, I didn't really get.
Oh, yeah. So basically, he's an international kind of an immigration consultant. He's making the case that what really drove up the labor pool was the admission of a bunch of essentially fake international students, right? That ostensibly came here to study, but they were really going to what have been colloquially called diploma mills, right? Like crap community college type models that basically you show up and pay for 2 years and you get some kind of a worthless diploma. What then happened is during COVID, sorry, I'm talking too fast. The federal government changed rules allowing those same students to work. I think that I can't remember, it's on the slide. The limits of how much they could work went up, I think past 20 hours a week, almost to full time. And then you got a flood of people coming to these garbage colleges, basically as a way to get into the country and start working to then claim permanent residency. And it just, according to him, it really bulked up the number of, like it just jacked up the labor pool, right? Lots of excess labor, so very, very low wages, kind of can prevail through that bottom end of the market.
Next. Oh, it was just with the low fertility, how there was all the arguments on.
A little further to
Oh, there was the arguments, economics, housing, religiosity, contraception, but then we basically said these like doesn't fully explain it, and then there was the argument about status. So I'm just wondering, because then there was also an argument saying it's not fully status. So is there one like main reason, or is it just kind of all of these together?
So I would suspect there's a lot of causes. Well, the case that Kurtz is making is that the strongest explanatory factor would be status, right? Being a parent is inherently kind of a low status thing, right? And maybe that's appropriate, right? It doesn't take much to become a parent. But it used to be something that had a lot of social value, and so people had a lot of kids. It's now something that has little social value in terms of status, right? And so people naturally respond by having as few children as they can get away with, essentially.
Mhm. Okay, and then I was just then confused with the status types and how we were talking about pre-enlightenment era and then how it switched. I just
Yeah.
don't really get
Okay.
the
So
transition.
basically, like, there's essentially the argument he makes is there's three ways of gaining status, right? You can either do it through dominance, right, which is like conquer my foes, through virtue, right, having some kind of moral quality, that makes you worthy of status. So, in the past, it was like sexual purity, motherhood, piety to religion, right? Those kinds of things that would, if you were very pious, you would see it as high status, right? Um, what he makes the argument of is the Enlightenment. The other one, sorry, that in virtue is like by virtue of your birth, right? So you're born into like the nobility, so that grants you status, whereas if you're a peasant, you're lower down status. You can't really change that one. What he says is, sorry,
It says dominance, virtue, success. So is the birth all
birth is in virtue. Like your birth would be
okay.
in virtue if you live in a society with like really rigid social classes, right?
Mhm.
So something like the nobility, the peasantry, the royalty.
Mhm.
What he says is the Enlightenment broadly kind of sweeps away both dominance and especially virtue as ways of getting status and replaces it with success, right? So your economic success in particular.
Mhm.
And that itself sort of leads to a reduction in fertility, which he'll point back to those numbers from like when we see the French Revolution happening.
Mhm.
Fertility immediately drops. That's an Enlightenment movement, and then you start to see success, especially economic, as being how you move up in terms of status, right? And then that becomes the principal measure, and people adjust accordingly, right? Suddenly, having kids isn't a way of getting status, especially for women, so they start to work towards more economic success.
That's everything.
All right,
Okay, thank you.
no worries.
Have a good-
Quick question.
Sure.
In this selection,
Which
you
one
did-
is this?
this is the
Oh,
families. You didn't touch on this slide, but they're kind of like the same as what you
oh,
did here.
yes. So I compressed those down. I did not update the slides that
Okay.
I gave you.
'Cause
I just
they're-
there was a little
they're
bit
the
of
same.
repetition in them, so I
Yeah.
just kind of like
Okay, so I
crunched
wanted
them into smaller numbers. Yeah, it's metal, so
Okay.
your magnetic case sticks to it.
okay, because I just put like all the slides to the top,
Sure.
and then you think like when you do the midterm, but I don't need to repeat these because it's the same, right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
A quick question. So the final schedule for the short right now,
Okay.
I was wondering if you could possibly like move it earlier. I think that would help everyone because
So I can't move the date of the final. If you have like they set it, right? They tell me what date it's on. I think moving it earlier would put it like on the last day of classes, and we're not allowed to do that. Trust me, if I could do the exam all on the last day of class, I would 100% do that, and
Yeah.
so would everyone else, which is why they don't let us do it.
Makes
Because suddenly students would have 5 exams, all on the same day. So yeah, unfortunately I can't. If you have like some compelling like
no, I don't.
life reason, we can always make exceptions.
I would just prefer to get it out of the way, but
I-
I'm beginning.
I would too, to be honest, but yeah, unfortunately, central scheduling tells me your exam must be this day. I'm like, okay,
Makes-
sold. Like I can't change it. So sorry. Like, yeah, honestly, if I could, I would, and I've tried, and I'm like, can I just have it? And they're like, okay, well,
Okay.
cheers. I do, yes. What are you applying to? Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely better. Yeah, that's you're welcome. So it's Tazo Wild Sweet Orange. Yeah, no worries. All right.
Maybe touch.